This morning's reading is Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. It can be found on page, I didn't see it. What's it say in the bulletin?
869.
869, thank you. Then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. And when his friends heard it, they went out to seize him, for they had said, "He is beside himself." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons." And he called to them, and he said to them in parables, "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods, unless he first binds the strong man, and indeed he may plunder his house. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the sons of men, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemies against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin, for they had said he has an unclean spirit." And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him. And they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking around on those who sat about him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
In 1999, a movie came out called Dogma. A lot of it takes place in New Jersey. It stars Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, and they are renegade angels. Alanis Morissette is God, and George Carlin is a Catholic cardinal. I'm not sure what was harder for the Catholic Church to take in that time. Alanis Morissette is God, or George Carlin is a Catholic cardinal. In one scene, Cardinal Carlin unveils his new publicity campaign for the Catholic Church. There's a group of press and onlookers in front of a church in Red Bank listening to him speak. He says, "I recognize how the media and the public view the current Catholic Church. They see it as a passé and archaic institution, even hokey at times. So the church has appointed this year to be a time of renewal of both faith and style. So they've decided to rebrand the church, and they've come up with a new slogan. Here's the slogan. You ready? Catholicism. Wow." It's great, isn't it? Further, they've decided to retire the image of Jesus hanging on the cross. Too depressing. In its place, they've instituted a whole new image of Jesus. They're still kicking a name around the office, but so far they've come up with this: Buddy Christ. Here's my interpretation of what Buddy Christ looks like. George Carlin unveils this life-size statue of Buddy Christ, and he says, "Well, look at it. Doesn't it pop?" On a lot of days, I like Buddy Christ. I want Buddy Christ. I want the Jesus who is easy and nice and comfortable. I don't want the Jesus that occasionally gets angry, that calls Peter Satan and says, "Get behind me." Or like this morning, I don't want the Jesus who seems rude and out of line in our text and says to his mothers and brothers, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" You are my mother and my brothers and my sisters. The Jesus in our text this morning is not Buddy Christ. Buddy Christ probably wouldn't say that to his family. Buddy Christ is also an accurate portrayal of how our culture often views Jesus. That being, it's about Jesus and me. Jesus with our arms around each other, separate from our community of faith. Buddy Christ speaks to the idea that the life of faith is about Jesus and me and not Jesus and us. As long as Jesus and me are okay, our community of faith is not really that necessary. The Jesus of our text this morning has much to say about the community of faith, this family that comes alongside us in the journey of faith. This text can be a challenging one, especially Jesus' reaction to his family. It's helpful to remember the Gospels are not necessarily biographies written about Jesus. They're more a narrative about Jesus, a story written to a specific community. Mark's Gospel is written to a specific community, as was Matthew's and Luke's and John's. In each community, there are specific issues taking place, and the Gospel is written to describe the life of Jesus and to also address what's happening in that community. If a Gospel writer were writing today to the Community Presbyterian Church in Kendall Park, they would undoubtedly know that your pastor has just left for sabbatical. And some of the narrative might address that reality, that being life in community without your pastor. Which is fascinating because as I read this text, which I didn't pick, this is the lectionary's text for today, I am seeing and I am hearing and I am reading community. In our text, Mark describes a house. So let's open the window a little bit. Let's peer in the front door. And let's see what Mark and Jesus might have to say about this house. After a long day of healing and teaching, Jesus has come back to this house to rest. But instead, the crowd has found him. His family is on his way to restrain him. They think he's nuts. The scribes, the religious leaders, they think he's a devil. There is tension in this house. Can you feel it? And Jesus says, a kingdom is divided against itself. That kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. So today this house might look like this. Or it might have 8 sides to it, like the octagon. Or the living room at Gabby's house or Heather's house for Bible study. Or the kitchen down at St. Mary's for Trenton, in Trenton. Or even on the river today for canoeing. The house is where we are as a community. And Jesus says this house, if it is divided against itself, this house will not stand. So Kim and I live in a condominium complex in Morristown. Kim's lived there for the last 13 years. I have for the last 2. It's a community. It really is. We often gather together with people at our age for dinners and get-togethers. In the summers and the weekends, we meet at the community grill for a cookout, all ages. We bring a dish, we sit and we talk and we swap stories. We have a pool where we meet to swim, but also to be together, to share our lives with one another. I know if something happened to Kim or me, I could rely on my neighbors. If I was in a bind, needed a hand, they'd have my back, and I'd have their back. We support each other. Most of the time, we get along. But like any community, any house, arguments and disagreements and tension arise. But the difference between that condominium complex, that community, and a community of faith, a house like this, is they each are built upon a completely different framework. In my condominium community, when we argue and disagree, and sometimes hurt each other, and right now the pool hasn't opened on time, and people are angry and frustrated with one another in this house, we go back home and move on with our lives. Because the expectation is not reconciliation. Sometimes it happens and we patch up our differences. But overall, the community can still remain divided and still exist, still stand, because this particular house can exist without reconciliation. Inside the house that Mark describes, the community Jesus envisions is a community built upon the foundation of forgiveness and reconciliation. The house will not stand without forgiveness and reconciliation. In verse 28, Jesus says, "Trust me, people will be forgiven for all their sins." He says it in such a nonchalant way, almost taking it for granted. I think we read this verse too fast. We need to slow down a little bit, let it sit with us, and not move on so quickly to the next verse, the unforgivable sin, which I'll get to in a second. The Catholic Franciscan priest, Richard Rohr, I think, describes forgiveness best when he says, "We have been accepted, and we are invited to accept that we have been accepted." This house is made up of a community that knows they have been forgiven, a community that knows they have been accepted. This is the house, this is the community that we are invited to be a part of. To not accept this news, this good news, is probably the unforgivable sin that Jesus talks about. The scribes, the religious leaders, they believe Jesus has an unclean spirit. So to them, he's not Son of God, and the Spirit is not with him. Which means they've cut themselves off from ever truly knowing they have been forgiven and accepted. They have been accepted. Jesus just said it in the previous verse. They just won't know it, and they'll never experience it. And not knowing that will make it very difficult to extend forgiveness to someone else. In this house, in this community of faith, we are invited to know that we have been accepted, and then live that out with each other. When forgiveness and reconciliation are not a core foundation of our community, the house will crumble. It won't stand. From the outside, it may look intact. 4 walls, a nice carpet, a few stained glass windows. But on the inside, it will be crumbling. It'll not be the community that Jesus envisions. This doesn't mean we don't argue or disagree or get frustrated with one another. For this is how we grow. This is actually where a lot of our growth will happen. Which is why community is so important. So we commit to loving one another, despite our differences. Despite our different political opinions, despite our varying beliefs on the direction we think this house should move in the future. And as we do that,